This is a Poison Terminator podcast. My name is Carlo De Olim. And in this episode, we will be talking about the dangerous effects of synthetic cannabinoids. To better understand this subject, I'm here with my guest, Sabra Botch-Jones. Sabra is an assistant professor and forensic toxicologist at Boston University School of Medicine. She conducts research in the area of forensic toxicology and analytical chemistry. Sabra is involved with the National Safety Council's Alcohol, Drugs, and Impairment. She began her career with the Federal Aviation Administration's Bioaeronautical Sciences Research Laboratory and served as a senior forensic toxicologist at the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office in Texas. Welcome to the show, Sabra.
Thank you for having me.
So, Sabra, what are synthetic cannabinoids?
It's a great question. So synthetic cannabinoids are synthesized chemicals that traditionally, some of these chemicals were actually synthesized to study how the compound tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, which is the active component of marijuana, actually interacts with the human brain. But today, many of these compounds have been synthesized specifically to be sold for illicit drug use.
We hear the term cannabinoid in synthetic cannabinoid. Is it similar to marijuana or other synthetic form?
Other than the fact that some of these compounds are actually synthesized to interact with the cannabinoid receptors in the human body, other than that, their similarity really does not match up with THC. These compounds can elicit a wide range of effects and be far more potent than traditional marijuana.
And what are the effects that synthetic cannabinoids can have on the body?
So researchers and emergency room physicians and users have reported a number of effects. Some of the effects do mimic that of THC, such as some of the positive feelings like an elevated mood, altered perception, but users also experience things that are like hallucinations, paranoia, anxiety. Further, some adverse effects have also occurred with their use, including heart attacks, as some of these compounds actually raise blood pressure and reduce the amount of blood that's being supplied to the heart. In poison control center calls, based on the use of these substances, they've been reported, individuals report rapid heart rate, vomiting, we've seen violent behavior, and even suicidal thoughts.
How are these substances used? Are they used like marijuana?
In some cases they are, where in early days when we began encountering these substances in convenience stores and in head shops, they were sold in packets of a plant material where the synthetic cannabinoids had been sprayed onto the plant material and the substance could be smoked. But they can be used in other ways. So if they're in a liquid formulation, they could be administered orally or through the mouth, through sublingual administration, or added to other drugs, such as adding them to e-liquids and smoking them in that way as well.
What are the contents in the synthetic cannabinoids that are considered dangerous? Is it the synthetic cannabinoids or the other contents that are added?
It's the synthetic cannabinoids, which contain the dangerous materials or compounds that can elicit all the adverse effects and have even caused death in some cases. But these substances are being manufactured in not only clandestine labs here in the U.S., but also in China and India and other places worldwide. And there's not a lack of control that's going on within the laboratories. So other contaminants can also be encountered in these substances. The dosing is not going to always be correct, and you're not going to know exactly what compound that you're dealing with. There are hundreds of these compounds have been identified to date. So one, you don't really know what an individual has used, nor does the individual really know that when they purchase these substances. And then two, you don't really know how they were manufactured and if there are other adverse chemicals that might be present in that substance that they're using.
Who uses these substances? Teens, adults?
That's a great question. Really, the user age groups vary. Primarily, you see it in adolescents, young adults, where they can easily obtain these substances. Like as I mentioned, traditionally they were being obtained in convenience stores and head shops, but also they can be obtained via the internet. But also, too, we find these substances being abused in other populations, such as individuals who don't want to be detected for drug use, and these could be individuals who are being routinely drug tested. So it could be pretty much anyone.
So what you mentioned to me right now is that people uses these substances despite the dangers because like it's not easy to get detected in tests.
Exactly. Traditional drug screening tests that we currently have typically target very specific drug classes, such as opioids or cocaine, drugs that we've encountered routinely over the past decades and decades. However, with synthetic cannabinoids, there are so many different types of compounds, and it's really challenging to develop a quick and efficient test to screen for these drugs in these routine drug testing settings. So it really relies heavily on forensic toxicology labs that have mass spectrometry available to them to actually be able to detect these compounds.
Why do you think these substances are still being sold in convenience stores and online despite it being dangerous?
That's a great question. I think it's availability, ease of use. In some cases, there still is lack of education about the dangers of their use. But when an individual wants to, say, try a substance, if it's easy to obtain, it may be the one that they choose.
Do you know the name of the brands of synthetic cannabinoids?
Yes, they change quite a bit. One of the first drug seizures that in the Tarrant County lab that I was there for, some of the names were K2, Spice, Barely Legal, but the packaging in which they came in really ranged. They were very colorful, had some cartoon images on them and things like that, and the names just really ranged as far as the street names go.
And do we see the same effects with all brands of synthetic cannabinoids?
Not necessarily. They're going to have different potencies and binding affinities, so they are going to produce varying degrees of adverse and positive effects, if you will, or the effects that, say, a drug user is seeking. But because there's not a lot of control in the amount that might be present in a packaging or the amount that the user is actually going to be ingesting, there's a wide range of effects. So it really is dependent on the drug and how much they use and how much that is actually available in the package that they obtain.
And are there any contraindications when taking synthetic cannabinoids?
As far as with other drugs, unfortunately, when it comes to drug use, typically an individual is not just taking one substance, whether they intend to do that or not. So they're often also co-administering other drugs, including alcohol. And so that really does make dealing with an individual who is experiencing adverse effects based on these drugs, including for everything from, say, a person who gets into an issue where they need to seek medical treatment, because if they are under the influence or being impaired or intoxicated by a variety of different drugs, treatment can be really challenging.
How does the severity of the effects of synthetic cannabinoids compare to marijuana or other drugs?
Well, what we see with the synthetic cannabinoids is extreme paranoia, violent behavior, behavior that has resulted in harm to other individuals and including themselves as well. And we see this more often, say, with the synthetic cannabinoids than with our traditional marijuana.
Do we know anything about its addictive potency?
Well, there's a lot we don't know about these compounds. One, they're constantly changing. The compounds that we originally saw around 2010, 2011 are completely different from the compounds that we're currently seeing in our forensic casework and in our clinical toxicology samples. And so because of that, really the scientific community is always a step behind in trying to understand, one, can we identify what the compound is? Two, what are all the effects, both the pharmacological effects, the pharmacodynamic and kinetic effects of these drugs? What are the long-term effects? We really are lacking in the scientific knowledge related to these drugs. And part of the reason is the dangers associated with trying to study these drugs in humans and understanding more about them. It can be really challenging to fill in the gaps in our scientific knowledge related to these drugs.
From what you studied, what are the usual signs that we see in a synthetic cannabinoid overdose?
They've seen a number of different signs, including heart attacks, vomiting, as I mentioned, the violent behavior as well. In individuals who present to the emergency room, it really depends on sort of what's happening at the time of their presentation and how they're going to be treated. For example, if they are experiencing violent behavior, maybe or extreme anxiety or paranoia, they might be treated with a class of compounds called benzodiazepines to sort of calm them down. Also, too, if they are vomiting or feeling nausea, they might be treated with an antiemetic or something that's going to help the nausea subside. And sedation, possibly, for individuals who are extremely violent when they present to the emergency room.
Are there any antidotes that we can administer, like naloxone, which is administered for a fentanyl overdose?
Right. Well, part of the problem with this group of drugs is there's so many. There are hundreds of these compounds, and when an individual is experiencing an overdose or they're seeking medical treatment related to using these compounds, there's really not enough time to identify at that moment what exactly that person used, and unless they can sort of convey that information to the medical personnel. But even if they give them the packet that they took, we still don't know if that's going to give us enough information to know which drug they actually took. So the answer to that is not really. They really have to treat the symptoms that they see upon arrival. But it's very important also, too, that they go back and they actually test to see what drug the individual was under the influence of when they arrived, because that helps us to educate the public about the dangers of the use, educate the scientific community about what we should be looking for in these populations, whether they're coming to the emergency room or whether they're driving under the influence or overdose.
You've just said that it's difficult to identify synthetic cannabinoids in routine toxicological screening tests, and it can be difficult for a physician to identify the cause of symptoms in people consuming synthetic cannabinoids because of the various chemicals it contains. Is there anything that someone who witnessed a synthetic cannabinoid overdose can do to help a physician identify the cause of the intoxication?
I think one of the most important things, whether it's providing the information, say, to the physician, or unfortunately, if the person is a drug user and they've overdosed and died, to the person investigating their death, is to provide information. So if there is any knowledge about what the user had ingested at the time of the event, providing that information to them. Sometimes having the substance that they use, even if it's just the packaging, can be incredibly helpful for the toxicology lab. That substance can be tested by a drug chemistry laboratory, identify what that substance is, and if you can identify what it is they took, you can go back and specifically look for those molecules related to those compounds so that you could possibly identify if that was the factor related to the individual's event or death.
What are some concrete actions that we could take as citizens to raise awareness about the dangers of synthetic cannabinoids?
I think with any type of prevention programs related to drug use is education, whether it's educating yourself about the drugs that could be out there, educating your children, family members about the dangers of drug use, having those conversations, understanding when you see something in the media, maybe talking about why those are dangerous, or trying to find more information about why substances such as the synthetic cannabinoids are so dangerous to use.
We've just heard some important and useful facts from the scientist and educator. We would like also to know the person behind the scientist. So I ask you, Sabra, why did you choose to do research on synthetic drugs? Why this particular subject out of several research teams?
That's a really great question. To answer that would be when I was in the medical examiner's office at the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office in Texas. I did have a case where a young man bludgeoned himself to death using a wooden sword. And when we performed the toxicological analysis on the specimens obtained at autopsy of that individual, they came back completely negative. And we were left wondering how an individual could switch from a young man into a psychotic event that resulted in self-harm and ultimately this individual's death. We were really fortunate in that case in that one of the other drug users that was present at the time of their death provided the substance that the individual used. And in that particular case, it involved a different group of novel psychoactive substances, which are called the N-bomb compounds. But like the synthetic compounds, these drugs are also very, very potent and elicit very extreme, violent psychotic episodes in individuals, and have resulted in individuals' death through some of the actions they take after using these drugs. And so that really opened my eyes personally into all these different drugs that are out there, and the fact that without sensitive analytical techniques, we were never going to know enough about these compounds in a person who's used them. And so that was my turning moment for me in choosing to sort of focus in my research on novel psychoactive substances like the synthetic cannabinoids.
Sabra, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the show and to contribute to empower people to take action to reduce toxic exposure.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
And that was Sabra Botch-Jones, who's an assistant professor and forensic toxicologist at Boston University School of Medicine. That's all for today. I'm the Poison Terminator, and I'll be back for another episode next week. Have a great day.